The final word from Silas Graves was not a word at all, but the clink of 3 silver dollars on the polished wood of the solicitor's desk. They were the last insult, a punctuation mark on a sentence of dispossession. Ilara watched them spin and settle, her own reflection staring back from their worn faces, distorted and small. Outside the window, the town of Promise Creek went about its day, blissfully ignorant or willfully blind to the quiet violence happening in that stuffy room. "The deed is for the folly," Silas said, his voice thick with the false piety he wore like a Sunday coat. He was her late husband's brother, a man who had clapped Thomas on the back at their wedding, and now stood as his legal executioner. 40 acres, clear title. It was our grandfather's first claim. More sentimental value than practical, I'm afraid. The solicitor, Mr. Hemlock, avoided her eyes, shuffling papers that smelled of dust and deceit. He knew, as did everyone in that room, that the folly was a cruel joke. It was a wind-swept knob of rock and thistle north of town, a place where nothing grew, where the wind scoured the earth down to bare stone. It was land so worthless it had been abandoned for 2 generations. Thomas had laughed about it, calling it the family's pet rock. Now it was Ilara's entire world. The farm she and Thomas had built, the one with the deep black soil and the creek running through the east pasture. The house with the porch she had sanded herself. All of it now belonged to Silas. A forgotten clause in a brittle family document, a handshake deal made by men long dead, had been Silas's weapon. He had waited until Thomas was in the ground a scant month before wielding it. She had nothing. The $3, the clothes on her back, a deed to a pile of rocks, and Ghost, Thomas's loyal wolfhound mix, who waited for her on the boardwalk outside, his massive head low, sensing the shift in their universe. The community of Promise Creek had offered its condolences at the funeral, plates of cold ham and dry biscuits. Now, they offered only averted gazes and pitying whispers. She was 24 years old, a widow, and now a pauper. "You'd be wise to sell the deed for whatever you can get, Ilara," Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner, had advised, his eyes full of a kindness that felt like another form of dismissal. "Use the money for a ticket east. Go back to your people." She had no people to go back to. There was only forward. She looked at the 3 silver dollars in her palm. They were not enough for a ticket east. They were not enough for a room for the month. But they were enough for a choice. She pushed open the mercantile door, the bell announcing her like a town crier. The low murmur of conversation stopped. She walked past the barrels of pickles and sacks of flour, her boots making a lonely sound on the floorboards. She went to the back, where the tools hung like skeletons. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "A pick, the heavy one, and a shovel." Mr. Gable blinked, his face a mask of confusion. "Ilara, that land, you can't farm it. You can't even dig a proper post hole." "I am not asking for advice, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice holding a new, hard edge she hadn't known she possessed. "I am a customer with coin." She laid the 3 silver dollars on the counter. He weighed them in his hand, then weighed her with his gaze. He saw the set of her jaw, the unwavering stillness in her eyes. With a sigh that surrendered all argument, he wrapped the handles of the tools in burlap. The cost took every cent. She was left with nothing but iron, wood, and a worthless piece of paper. She walked out of the store, the tools heavy on her shoulder. Ghost rose to his feet, a silent gray shadow at her side. She did not look back at the faces in the windows, the men on the boardwalk who stopped to stare. She turned her back on Promise Creek, on the life that had been stolen from her, and began the long walk north. The road dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint deer trail, and then to nothing at all. The landscape grew harsher, the trees stunted and bent. The wind began its ceaseless assault, a physical presence that pushed and pulled, stealing the warmth from her skin. It took her half a day to reach it. The folly. It was worse than she had imagined. A bald, stone-crowned hill rose from the plains like a weathered knuckle. The grass was thin and pale, clinging to life in the crevices of the rock. A few skeletal junipers were the only trees, their branches twisted into shapes of permanent agony by the wind. There was no shelter, no water, no life. She dropped the tools. The clang of metal on stone was a sound of profound finality. Ghost whined softly, pressing against her leg. For a long, terrible moment, Ilara believed the town was right. She had been a fool. The hill was a tombstone, and she had just walked willingly into her own grave. Despair washed over her, cold and heavy as a winter flood. Her knees felt weak, the sting of tears burning her eyes. She sank to the ground, the rough, gritty soil pressing into her palms. This was the end. But as she sat there, broken, something shifted. The wind, which had been a constant roar, seemed to drop for a moment. In the sudden quiet, she felt it. A subtle difference in the air against her cheek. She turned her head. A few feet away, at the base of a low, jutting cliff face that formed the southern flank of the hill, the air was almost still. The wind was flowing up and over the rock, creating a pocket of calm in its lee. She stood up, her despair momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of raw survival instinct. She walked to the rock face. It was not a sheer cliff, but a layered, broken escarpment, maybe 15 feet high. As she ran her hand over its surface, she felt something else. The rock was cool, but it was not the biting, damp cold of granite. It had a strange, dry texture, almost soft. Her shovel. She grabbed it and scraped at the thin layer of soil at the base of the rock. The blade screeched against something solid. She used the pick next, swinging it with the last of her strength. It struck with a dull thud, and a chunk of creamy white stone broke free. Ilara knelt and picked it up. It was limestone. Her father, a stonemason in the town she'd left as a girl, had worked with stone like this. He had taught her its names and natures. Granite was the bones of the world, hard and unforgiving. Sandstone was compressed time, gritty and prone to flake. But limestone was different. It was workable. It could be cut, shaped, and it held warmth. Then she saw it, a dark, damp patch on the rock near the ground. A slow, persistent drip of water, clear and cold, was seeping from a fissure. It wasn't a spring, not a gushing torrent, but it was constant. It was water. The wind screamed over the top of the hill, unheard in her small pocket of stillness. She looked at the workable stone, the promise of shelter. She looked at the steady drip of water, the promise of life. She looked at Ghost, whose tail gave a single, hopeful thump against the ground. The despair was gone, burned away by a new, ferocious resolve. The town was wrong. This was not a grave. It was a foundation. The work began that same day. It was not building, it was burrowing. She was not a carpenter raising a frame against the sky. She was a creature of the earth, digging her way into it. Her plan was born of pure necessity, to excavate a space directly into the hillside, using the limestone face as her back wall. The earth itself would be her insulation on 3 sides, and the rock would be her anchor. The first few days were a blur of screaming muscles and raw, blistered hands. The topsoil was thin, a mere 6 inches of dust and roots. Beneath it lay a layer of compacted clay and gravel, and then the limestone began. It was not solid bedrock, but stratified layers, a geological cake she could attack one slice at a time. She learned the rhythm of the work, the sharp crack of the pickaxe finding a weakness, the grating scrape of the shovel clearing the debris, the satisfying heft of a stone slab pried loose. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a cold fury. Every swing of the pick was a blow against Silas, against the town, against the fate that had been handed to her. Her hands, accustomed to the softness of baking dough and mending cloth, were shredded. Blisters formed, broke, and bled. The skin thickened into a yellow callus, a tough armor she earned one painful swing at a time. Ghost was her constant, silent foreman, watching from a patch of shade, his presence a bulwark against the crushing loneliness. Slowly, agonizingly, a shape began to emerge. A pit, 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep, dug straight into the gentle slope of the hill. The back wall was the sheer face of the limestone deposit. Now came the true labor. She needed a front wall and a roof. Using a heavy log as a lever and smaller stones as a fulcrum, she began to quarry her building materials from the hillside itself. She learned to read the stone, to find the fracture lines and drive ironwood wedges into them. She would hammer them in, listen to the groaning tension within the rock, and then pour water into the cracks. As the wood swelled, the pressure would build until, with a great sigh or a sharp crack, a slab would split free. Moving the stones was a battle of leverage and will. Some were the size of loaves of bread, easily carried. Others were as big as coffins, weighing hundreds of pounds. She rolled them on logs, inching them into place to form the foundation of her front wall. She had no mortar yet, so she fitted them together like a puzzle, a technique her father had called dry stacking. It was slow, meticulous work. A single misplaced stone could compromise the entire structure. Days bled into weeks. Her body changed. The soft lines of her former life were burned away, replaced by the hard angles of muscle. Her world shrank to the scrape of the shovel, the weight of stone, the burn in her shoulders, and the deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. She focused on the systems, the interconnected parts of her survival. The water seep was first. She carefully dug around it, creating a small basin. She found a deposit of dense, gray clay down in a gully a quarter-mile away. Over 2 days, she hauled bucket after bucket of it back to her site. She lined the basin with a thick layer of the clay, packing it down until it was watertight. The slow drip of the seep began to fill it. Within a week, she had a small, clean cistern, protected from the wind and sun by the overhang of the rock. It was her first victory. Next was heat. A house of stone in this climate would be a tomb without a powerful source of warmth. She designed a fireplace not in the center of the room, but built directly against the massive limestone back wall. The stone itself would become a thermal mass. It would absorb the heat from the fire all day, and then radiate it back into the small space all night long after the flames had died to embers. The chimney was the most dangerous part. She built it with the flattest, most stable stones she could find, her heart in her throat as she stacked them higher and higher, weaving them through a narrow opening she left in the roof. The roof was a combination of scavenged timber and earth. She felled the few sturdy junipers on the property, limbed them, and laid them across the tops of her stone walls. On top of this, she layered thick hides she traded for later, then a layer of the clay, and finally a thick blanket of the sod and soil she had first excavated. Her home would be a living part of the hill, a small, warm burrow beneath a green blanket. She was running out of things she could find or make. She needed salt to preserve what little meat she could trap. She needed an iron pot that wouldn't crack on the fire. She needed seeds if she was ever to grow anything. She had to go back to town. The journey back to Promise Creek felt different. She was no longer a victim fleeing a disaster. She was a laborer, returning for supplies. When she walked down the main street, her clothes stained with clay and her hands scarred, the whispers that followed her had changed. The pity was still there, but it was now mixed with a kind of morbid curiosity. Mr. Gable's bell chimed her arrival again. This time, Silas was in the store, holding court near the counter. He saw her, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he boomed, for the benefit of the other customers. "Still playing in the dirt, Elara? I told you that hill would break you before winter. You should have taken the ticket east." Elara met his gaze. She felt the eyes of the others on her, the farmers, the trappers, the ranchers' wives. She did not say a word. She walked to the counter and placed a small, neatly tied bundle on the wood. Inside were a dozen perfect, smoked prairie hen breasts, trapped and cured with a skill Thomas had taught her. "I need to trade," she said to Mr. Gable, ignoring Silas completely. "For a bag of salt, a 5-pound sack of potatoes to seed, and your smallest cast-iron pot." Gable looked at the smoked birds, then at her. He saw not a madwoman, but a survivor. He nodded slowly. "That's a fair trade." As he gathered her things, Silas stepped closer. "You can't eat rocks, Elara. When the first snow flies, you'll come crawling back, and the door will be closed." She took her sack of supplies, the iron pot heavy in her hand, and turned to face him. For the first time, she spoke to him directly, her voice low and steady as the stone she now lived with. "Do not mistake me for a woman who needs your door, Silas. I am building my own." She walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The walk back to the folly felt shorter this time, lighter. She had faced the town, faced her tormentor, and had not broken. Back at her shelter, Ghost greeted her with a low woof, his tail wagging. He was her only family now, her only comfort in the vast, empty landscape. His warm, solid presence was a constant reminder that she was not entirely alone. He would often rest his great head on her lap as she sat by the fire at night, a silent guardian in their stone fortress. With her new supplies, she started the next phase, food. The top of the hill was useless, but she had her small, wind-sheltered courtyard in front of her dugout. She began building raised garden beds, using smaller stones to create low walls. Then came the most arduous task of all. The gully where she had found the clay also held a patch of rich black soil, washed down from richer lands upstream. For a week, she did nothing but haul soil. She filled her empty salt sack, heaved it onto her back, and made the half-mile round trip again and again. It was brutal, soul-crushing work. Her back screamed, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. She was filling her larder, one handful of dirt at a time. Into these beds she planted the potato eyes and the hardy kale and turnip seeds she had acquired. As autumn began to paint the distant cottonwoods yellow, a new nickname drifted out from town. They no longer just called her the Folly Widow. Brant, a trapper who had laughed with Silas in the store, had apparently visited her hill. He'd seen the smoke rising from her strange chimney and the glint of her shovel. He came back to town with a new story. He called her the Cave Girl, and the name stuck, a barb of mockery meant to paint her as a savage, a half-mad creature living in a hole in the ground. The mockery only fueled her. Let them laugh. They lived in their drafty wooden boxes, dependent on firewood they had to haul for miles. She lived in the embrace of the earth. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, her routine solidified into a steady, monastic rhythm. Wake before dawn, check the cistern, add a log to the fire, feeling the deep, radiant warmth of the limestone back wall. Let out the 3 scrawny chickens she had traded for with a passing tinker. their coop a small, stone-lined alcove in the wall. Tend the small garden, a patch of defiant green in a world of brown and gray. Check her snare lines. Work on chinking the walls, using a mortar she was beginning to perfect. This was her great discovery, the true secret of the folly. The limestone wasn't just for building. Her father had told her stories of the old ways. If you burned limestone at a high enough temperature, it underwent a chemical change, creating a volatile, powerful substance, quicklime. Mixed with sand and water, it created a mortar far superior to simple clay, a mortar that would set like iron. She built a kiln, a crude cylinder of stone packed with her gray clay, at a safe distance from the house. Her first attempts were failures. The fire wasn't hot enough, or she smothered it. But she learned. She built a small flue, figured out the right mix of juniper wood and dried brush. Finally, one cold afternoon, she succeeded. She cooked the rock for 2 days until it glowed cherry red. After it cooled, she carefully added a small amount of water. It hissed and steamed violently, the rock crumbling into a fine, brilliantly white powder that was hot to the touch. It was quicklime. It was a revelation. She mixed it with sand from the gully and used it to seal every crack and seam in her home. The wind, which had always found a way to whisper through the walls, was finally silenced. Her small dugout became a sealed chamber of warmth and safety. The first snows of November were a test. A week of freezing rain followed, coating the world in a thick, glittering shell of ice. In Promise Creek, the roads were impassable. Water barrels burst as they froze solid. Men slipped on their own porches and broke bones. But in Alara's home, it was just another day. The ice sheeted over her earthen roof, adding another layer of insulation. Her cistern, dug into the earth and protected by the overhang, did not freeze. The limestone walls, saturated with heat, kept the interior at a steady, comfortable temperature. She sat by her fire, mending a tear in her shirt, listening to the muffled sound of the ice storm, and she knew. She was ready. The blizzard of '83 did not arrive. It descended. For a week, the weather had been unnaturally calm and cold, the sky a strange, bruised purple at the horizon. Then, one afternoon, the world went silent. The wind died. The birds vanished. A heavy, leaden-gray ceiling lowered itself over the plains. Alara felt it in her bones. She brought the chickens inside, their nervous clucking a strange sound in her quiet home. She double-checked the seal on her door and stacked her precious firewood high beside the hearth. Ghost paced restlessly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Then the first flakes fell, not gentle drifters, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising wind. Within an hour, the world outside her small window vanished into a churning vortex of white. The wind came back, not as a push, but as a scream. It was a physical assault, a solid wall of force that hit the hill with the sound of 1,000 demons clawing at the stone. Inside, it was astonishingly quiet. The sound of the storm was a distant, muted roar, the fury of a beast locked outside. The earth and stone that surrounded her absorbed the vibration, deadened the sound. The fire in her limestone hearth burned with a steady, placid flame, its heat sinking deep into the rock. The air was warm and still. She sat on her small stool, ladling stew into a bowl, the scent of root vegetables and smoked meat filling the small space. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. In Promise Creek, it was apocalypse. The wind, funneled between the wooden buildings, became a battering ram. It tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. The snow, finer than dust, was driven through every crack and keyhole, piling in ghostly drifts inside locked homes. Wooden walls, which had seemed so solid, groaned and popped, the frozen timber contracting and splitting. Families huddled together, stuffing rags into the gaps in their walls, their entire stock of firewood burning away in a desperate, losing battle against the invasive cold. Chimneys, poorly built with cheap mortar, clogged with wind-packed snow and ice, backing up and filling rooms with blinding, choking smoke. The town's meeting hall, the symbol of their community, gave a great groan as a main support beam cracked under the weight of the snow on its roof. The confidence of Promise Creek, built on wood and pride, was shattering. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. For 3 days, Elara lived in her quiet, warm bubble. She tended her fire, fed her animals, ate her meals, and slept. Her systems held. The cistern provided water. The hearth provided warmth. Her small stores provided food. She had built not just a shelter, but an ark, and the flood was raging all around her. On the 4th day, a new sound cut through the muted roar of the wind, a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy plank door. It was a sound so alien in her solitary world that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. Ghost was already on his feet, a deep, warning growl starting in his chest. The banging came again, weaker this time, followed by a muffled cry. Elara unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the stone wall. A figure, a shapeless mound of snow and ice, collapsed into her home, falling onto the dirt floor in a cloud of freezing powder. She and Ghost dragged the person inside and forced the door shut against the storm's fury. She brushed the snow away from a small, frost-rimmed face. It was Mr. Gable's son, Thomas, a boy of no more than 10. His lips were blue, his skin the color of ash. She stripped off his frozen coat and wrapped him in the warmest blankets she had, piling them on her own cot by the fire. She forced warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, between his chattering teeth. Life and terror slowly returned to his eyes. "It's my father," he croaked, his voice raw. "The store, the roof, it's coming down. He's trapped. And my mother, the fever, she can't get warm." He was sobbing now, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear. "Everyone's freezing. The wood is gone. No one can get to their sheds." Elara looked at the terrified boy. She remembered Mr. Gable's pitying eyes. She remembered the whispers, the mockery. She looked at her own carefully stacked firewood, her sacks of potatoes and turnips, the resources she had bled for, her margin of survival. Helping them would cost her. It could cost her everything. But then she looked at the boy's face, streaked with tears and frostbite. He was not a mocker. He was just a child. And his family was dying. The memory of Silas's smug face flashed in her mind, a hot spark of anger. But the boy's shivering form extinguished it. This wasn't about Silas. This was about the woman she had become, a woman who built things that held, a woman who survived. What was the point of survival if it ended in a warm hole in the ground while others froze just beyond the door? There was no choice, not really. "Stay here," she told the boy. "Keep the fire fed. Do not let it go out." She put on her heaviest coat, a crude thing she had stitched together from old blankets and a cured deer hide. She went to the corner of her room where she kept her finished product. In sturdy burlap sacks were nearly 200 pounds of fine, white quicklime. It was her wealth, her security, her future. She loaded 2 sacks onto a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling wood. She added a precious armload of her own firewood, a bundle of kindling, and her shovel. She wrapped a thick scarf around her face, pulled her hat down low, and looked at Ghost. "Come on, boy," she said. "We have work to do." Opening the door was like opening the gate to hell. The wind and snow hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath. The world was a white, featureless chaos. But Ghost, his head low against the storm, knew the way. He was a gray phantom in the blizzard, and she followed him, leaning all her weight into the sled, her body a shield for its precious cargo. The journey to town was a nightmare. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind a constant, screaming enemy. But she was not the woman who had left Promise Creek months ago. Her body was hard, her will harder. She put her head down and pushed, one agonizing step at a time. She arrived in Promise Creek to a scene from a frozen apocalypse. The town was half buried, houses looking like strange, white mounds. A few figures were struggling through the drifts, their movements slow and desperate. She saw Silas Graves first. He and two other men were trying to shore up the collapsing front wall of the mercantile with splintering planks, their efforts futile against the immense weight of the snow. Silas turned as she approached, a ghost emerging from the storm with a dog and a sled. His face, already pale with cold and fear, went slack with utter disbelief. He stared at her, then at the sled, then back at her. He looked at her clothes, her strong, steady posture. This was not the broken widow he had exiled. This was someone else. "Ilara?" he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. She didn't waste time with words. She pushed past him, kicking the snow away from the base of the buckling wall. "Get me buckets of snow!" she yelled over the storm, her voice cracking like a whip. "Now!" They stared at her, confused. "More snow? Are you mad?" one of the men shouted. "Do it!" she commanded, and there was something in her voice, the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, that made them obey. She ripped open one of the sacks of quicklime. As they brought the buckets, she began shoveling the white powder into them, mixing it with the snow. The reaction was immediate and violent. The mixture hissed and steamed, boiling with a sudden, intense heat. It was a basic chemical reaction she had read about in one of her father's old engineering books, the slaking of lime. She poured the hot, slushy mixture along the base of the wall. It melted the packed ice and snow, relieving some of the pressure, and, as it cooled, would refreeze into a solid, stabilizing block of ice. She left them to it and went to the Gables home. Inside, the scene was grim. Mr. Gable was pinned by a collapsed section of his ceiling, his leg clearly broken. His wife lay shivering under a pile of blankets, her breathing shallow, in the grip of a fever. The house was deathly cold. Ilara went to work. With the help of another neighbor, she used the last of her firewood and kindling to restart their fire. The flue was blocked. She showed them how to use a small amount of lime mixed with water to create enough heat to melt the ice plug from below. Slowly, a draft returned. Smoke began to draw up the chimney. Warmth, blessed warmth, began to creep back into the room. The rescued boy, Thomas Gable, entered his home and saw what Ilara had done. He looked at his mother, whose shivering was already lessening, and at his father, now being tended to by the fire. He looked at Ilara, her face raw from the wind, her hands caked with lime and soot. He couldn't reconcile this powerful, competent woman with the pitiful creature the town had mocked. His eyes widened, filled with a dawning, profound understanding. This wasn't the cave girl. This was their savior. After the worst was over, after the fire was stable, and Mr. Gable was made as comfortable as possible, Ilara turned to leave. Mr. Gable, his face pale with pain and shame, called out to her. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. He looked at the sacks of white powder she had brought. What is that?" "It's lime," Ilara said simply, "from the hill." The silence in the room was heavier than the snow on the roof. The hill, the folly, the worthless land. It had produced this. It had produced her. Silas Graves found her as she was preparing her sled to return home. The storm was finally beginning to slacken, the wind losing its demonic edge. He stood before her, his own fine coat torn, his face haggard. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the storm. "We called you a fool, Ilara," he said, his voice raw. "We laughed at you. My God." He shook his head, looking not at her, but at the town she had just saved. "We were the fools." Ilara looked at her husband's brother, the man who had taken everything from her. She saw the shame in his eyes, the utter demolition of his pride. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, quiet emptiness. She had not done this for him, or for them. She had done it because it was necessary. She simply nodded, picked up the ropes of her sled, and began the long walk home. Her grace was in her silence. Her victory was in the simple act of turning away, her back straight, her purpose clear. When the blizzard finally broke, Promise Creek was a town humbled and transformed. The story of what Ilara had done spread faster than fire. They didn't call her the cave girl anymore. They spoke her name with a new reverence. They spoke of the folly lime as if it were gold dust. The aftermath was a new beginning. People didn't come to her for charity. They came to trade. The rancher who had once sneered at her brought 2 of his best ewes and a ram, asking for 100 pounds of lime to strengthen the mortar for his new barn foundation. The trapper, Brant, quietly left a stack of prime beaver pelts at her door in exchange for the sacks of lime he took to tan his hides. Mr. Gable, once he was healed, offered her a standing credit at the mercantile for anything she ever needed. Her lime became the town's most valuable currency, the foundation of its recovery. Silas Graves's influence withered. He was a man of wood, in a town that now understood the value of stone. He eventually sold his holdings and moved east, a diminished figure in the face of the quiet, indomitable woman he had tried to destroy. Promise Creek rebuilt itself, but differently. The new structures were stronger, with stone foundations set in lime mortar. They built with an eye toward the wind and the snow, incorporating the lessons learned from Ilara's dugout. Her home, once the Folly, became a landmark known as the Quarry House. Travelers carried her story to other settlements, a tale of resilience and ingenuity that became a part of the frontier's folklore. Years later, Ilara would stand on the crest of her hill, looking down at the lights of the town she had inadvertently saved. Her home was no longer just a dugout, but a sprawling, comfortable warren built into the earth, with a greenhouse for winter vegetables and pens for her small flock of sheep. The wind was just wind now, a familiar song rather than a threat. Ghost's descendant, a great gray hound with the same quiet eyes, rested his head on her hand. She had been given a worthless inheritance, a pile of rocks and scorn. But she had discovered that the most valuable things are not what you are given, but what you have the vision to build and the character to share. She had not sought revenge, she had simply refused to be broken, and in doing so, had rebuilt a world.